Hi, Delia.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. I'm going to introduce Dalia Othman, who's now talking to us live from Ramallah. It is what time?
It is 7:30,
Yeah,
38.
7 p.m. And I'm calling from Santa Barbara, California, and here it's 9:30 in the morning. Thanks for taking your evening to chat with us. So this recording is for my undergraduate students in digital activism and new media in the Middle East, out of the Film and Media Studies Department here at UC Santa Barbara. And you're going to address, Delia is a friend and a digital activist who now lives in Ramallah. She's co-founder of VecBox. She has been a research associate at Harvard's Berkman Center for Information Society, and she's published on digital activism in the Middle East uh, pretty prolifically and is well-rounded. And I'm excited to have her here to talk to us about her work and what she's doing now, and about blogs as a specific medium that really had an exciting, sort of invigorating flame about it. Historically, from around the middle to the end of the 2000s, and right before social media explosion and before the Arab uprisings in 2011, has changed. So we're going to talk a little bit about blogs. We're going to talk about Delia, and I'm going to mute myself. Thank you.
Thanks, Leila. Okay, so I'll start off with a really brief introduction about myself, and then move on to talk about sort of the historical significance of blogs and the research that I had been doing at Harvard's Berkman Center. So prior to coming back to Ramallah, I'm actually originally, I am Palestinian. I've lived in Palestine for a good chunk of my life, but for the past 2 years, I was a research fellow at Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society, and also a visiting scholar at MIT Center for Civic Media. And sort of historically, I was always interested, my background is in media, and I was always interested in how people can change mainstream narratives, how individuals and certain communities can sort of challenge the mainstream narrative that exists in media. And so with the explosion of social media, with blogs coming in on the scene in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, I became really interested in digital media and how the internet can actually help change the narrative itself, but also challenge certain things. So I went on to study technology, political communication, and then ended up doing research at Harvard, basically. And for the past 2 years, I've focused my research on online activism in the Arab world. There were two parts to this research. One was focused on the Arab blogosphere, and the other part was on Twitter and Twitter networks within certain Arab countries. So we focused on Egypt, Bahrain, and Tunisia. And so there were really some interesting findings. And what we really tried to look at was basically the network public sphere. I'd suggest looking up Yochai Benkler's definition of the network public sphere. It's basically, it's taking the Habermasian public sphere, taking the whole concept of what the internet has provided in terms of networking and transferred it to politics. So we're talking about having a community or a certain group of people who would communicate together, agree on certain political or social principles, and try to promote actual collective change. So we were trying to look at that. We were trying to look at the structures of the blogosphere, the different platforms, the structures of the communities online, and we're looking at the discussions and topics that were addressed. And this research isn't actually, I mean, it's novel in a sense, but there was also research that happened beforehand, and I sort of want to start from there from the start of how researchers started looking at that and how online activism began in the Arab world, and then slowly bring it to the present day and post-Arab revolutions and uprisings. So rewind, say, 10, 15 years. Blogging was somewhat a novel thing. Internet penetration was just in the sort of 10%, 15% throughout the Arab world. And keep in mind that in the Arab world, it's not one chunk, it's not all Arab world, but it's actually made up of different countries, different traditions, different dialects. So in each country you had different I want to say advancement in terms of technologies. But what we saw in the early 2000s were a group of people in Egypt, in Tunisia, even in Palestine, coming online and starting to blog. And they started to blog about things that weren't talked about in mainstream media. We call them early adopters, and they really were, the first people who came online and started speaking about topics that mattered to them. So you had a lot of people like Ala Abdel Fattah, who I'm sure Layla has talked to you about. There's Basel Khattabil, or Safadi in Syria. There are a number of people who really were the early adopters and wrote about political and social issues that in the Arab world wasn't talked about in mainstream media, because mainstream media was mostly controlled by the state. And so they provided an alternative narrative. And that slowly started to change with social media, where people started to shift towards Twitter. They started shifting towards Facebook and using that to sort of communicate and organize amongst each other to allow for social change or collective action. So in 2008, as sort of the blogosphere slowly started to emerge in the Arab world, Berkman also did research and basically studied the blogosphere then. And what was really fascinating was it was a huge, vast network. There were thousands and thousands of blogs in different countries. And of course, again, I go back to the whole point of it's not just Arab, it's actually country and nation based. So you had blogs from Egypt, you had blogs from Saudi Arabia, Tunisia or the Maghreb, North Africa, you had Lebanon, Palestine. And what was interesting at the time, for example, is that Saudi Arabia constituted the largest cluster or the second largest cluster of blogs after Egypt. At the time, for example, the topics that were discussed was Palestine. It was the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was a huge topic that was discussed in the Arab blogosphere, less so local politics at the time.
Do you think that's because of the war in Gaza in 2008, specifically in 2006? If you think historically, that's when the invasion in Lebanon happened with between the south of between Israel and Hezbollah.
I think that's definitely
what's going on in 2006, 2008. We might have forgotten already about things have changed so quickly.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's a huge part of it. I think the fact that Palestine is an ongoing conflict, and that there were spurts in sort of violence during those times. I think that was definitely part of it. And the other part is that domestically, even though there were conversations happening about, or say blogging happening about local issues, Palestine was still such a prominent topic. It was shortly after the Second Intifada had died down, and so Palestine was still, I guess, fresh in people's minds. And so that was one of the topics. For example, Islam as a religion was huge. You saw so many blogs that wrote about Islam. And then, so those were the main sort of findings that happened. And I would suggest looking at, Berkman has a copy of that study, so you could actually pull that up online and read it. It may be a bit long of a study, but it's definitely worth reading. Fast forward 2014, that's where I came in with a team of researchers, and we decided to look at the blogospheres and add Twitter to this post-revolutions. So you have, the revolutions started off in December of 2010 in Tunisia, and then sort of spanned through 2011, and I would say they're still ongoing in a lot of the countries, and in some countries they've turned into civil wars. And so we decided to sort of revisit this study and see what has happened since then. I would say 5-6 years post the initial study. And it was really fascinating. In terms of the Arab blogosphere, what we realized is that the blogosphere itself had shrunk. There were less blogs. And in many cases, countries sort of disappeared. So Saudi Arabia, that was the second cluster of blogs in the 2008-2009 study, disappeared completely.
However, they led the Twitter sphere.
Exactly. So Saudi Arabia, that's exactly the point.
By far, it's really remarkable, and I think it's worth study to see how much saturation in Arabic is actually coming from Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing. Like what we saw basically was a shift. So you have Saudi Arabia. They're the largest sort of, I think, population in the Arab world on Twitter. They completely disappeared from the blogosphere. So we anticipate, or we assume, that the shift has happened from the blogosphere to more microblogging or faster sort of social media sites. I'm gonna first, before I continue, I'm gonna share my screen.
I'm gonna put my hand down, so okay. I'm gonna put the video off.
Okay. So can you see the map?
Yeah, and the students yesterday in class we went over it a little bit, and
okay.
I pointed out the lack of regularity in the categorizing. How you have we have a name of a country like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Syria and Jordan, and then we have these odd, labeling like secular reformists and Islam focus.
Yeah.
Which sounds more about the blog, and then we have Muslim Brotherhood, which is a political party, and then we have these language-based analyses like Arabic, and okay.
So for the publication, which is hopefully coming out next month, we are probably going to change some of the labels or relabel some of them. But this was the initial labeling that we did as researchers, and basically this was. What we found is that it was nation-based, but there were a lot of clusters within the different nations. So some of the biggest blogging clusters were basically bloggers who wrote about personal life. We call them personal diaries. Or people who were interested in literature, wrote literature. So we had those people, but they were predominantly Egyptian. And you can see that in the Egypt cluster. I don't know if you see my mouse at all. But in the Egypt cluster, there are a bunch.
And what's that? And then there's like that big yellow one in the dot in the middle.
Yeah. So let me pull back and explain what the dots, the circles, and the colors mean. So basically, the colors themselves, the different colors signify different blogging clusters. So when you have a bunch of colors, or let's say you have the secular reformists, they're pink. So all the little dots that you see that are in pink are bloggers who we basically, after human coding, describe them as secular reformists. After going through their blogs, looking at their content, looking at what they're writing about, we basically analyzed the writings and decided that they basically blog about secular reform. They are secular and they try to reform. They're working on reform and separation between, hypothetically between church or mosque and state. There's geographically now, the reason why you have a massive cluster sort of on the top right hand corner where we have Egypt, that cluster, even though there are so many different colors, they're sort of clustered right next to each other, on top of each other. Those signify the blogs that pull each other together geographically. So that cluster, even though they're secular reformists or Muslim Brotherhoods, they are Egyptian. And they sort of pull to each other together because they are relevant. They link to the certain things, to the same things, and they follow each other as well. So that's basically it. That's why you see, for example, Egypt in one corner, Jordan, which is distinctly somewhere in the middle. You have Syria, and there's so many different sort of it spans out. So that's basically it. Now, like I said, in 2014, what we saw is the fact that Saudi Arabia disappeared. I'm gonna stop sharing for now. And so in the 2014 map, what we realized is that Saudi Arabia was no longer existent. We assumed that there was this major shift from blogging to Twitter. The other thing that I think is very peculiar, and as a Palestinian, obviously I'm very intrigued about, is the fact that Palestine was no longer a focal topic. It wasn't something that was discussed, and we actually went back after the Gaza war in 2014 and looked at the content on the blogs, and we realized that it really did not ignite as much of a conversation or discussion as it did in 2008. So on the contrary, what we started noticing is that people started to talk more and more about domestic issues that were happening politically, socially. In Egypt you saw some posts about sexual harassment that was happening in certain periods of time. Obviously, you had a split. You had a cluster of Muslim Brotherhood supporters, and you had people from the left as well. So you had different clusters. But I think at the end of the day, what we really realize is that the blogosphere did shrink in size, and a lot of people stopped blogging. And this is something that we're labeling as blogging fatigue. You had a huge Muslim Brotherhood cluster that still exists, but most of the bloggers had stopped blogging, and say it goes as far as 2009, but a lot of them stopped blogging in 2012 and onwards. And so very few Muslim Brotherhood supporters or bloggers continue to blog. And most of them, actually, what's interesting is that a lot of them had stopped blogging, but they had changed the banners on the blogs. So a lot of them had the Rab'a sign, which is the yellow background with the 4 fingers, which actually symbolizes what happened, the massacre that happened in 2013 when Sisi basically overthrew Morsi and took over leadership. So that was, for me, I think that is the main takeaway of this, is the fact that there is now a blogging fatigue that has happened throughout the Arab world, and we're seeing less and less bloggers. We're seeing that shift happen, sort of them shifting to Twitter and Facebook. And it was really interesting to see on Twitter how, for example, the conversation has shifted as well. So I'm going to quickly talk about the Twitter maps of Egypt and Bahrain really quickly. Sorry?
Where do you have them? Where are they?
I'm about to pull them up.
Oh, okay.
So let me do this. Okay. So this isn't labeled yet, and I'm hoping with the publication you'll see a better labeling of this. But this is really fascinating. This is a network map of the Egyptian Twitter sphere. And what you see is a very, very distinct divide. Again, the colors constitute people who tweet the same content, who use the same hashtags in a sense. They link to they follow each other. And what's really interesting is that there is this distinct divide. So the green clusters are supporters of the military, supporters of Sisi. The yellow cluster in the bottom are supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. The red clusters are what we're calling the non-aligned, those who don't support either side. And then on the blue, what's really fascinating, the blue side is on the left. They are people who aren't talking politics. They're basically talking about everyday life, social issues, tech issues. So it's really separate politically. And the purple cluster in the middle are mostly Western mainstream media. And what we're calling, and what I like to call, and this is based on Ethan Zuckerman's sort of labeling, bridge figures. So prominent Egyptians who are on Twitter who are bridge between sort of the Western media and what's going on in Egypt. And many of them are actually, sorry?
You said these are the purple ones. They're very central.
Yeah, they're very central, exactly. They're very central, and they're sort of in the red cluster as well. And a lot of them are actually the early adopters that I mentioned earlier in this talk. Basically, they are the people who were some of the first bloggers in Egypt. So it's actually fascinating to see this. And I think one main and I'm going to say just one main takeaway, is basically that you see like polarization on Twitter. You see most of the military supporters in one cluster, the Muslim Brotherhood, the non-aligned, and you don't see a lot of dialogue going on between them. The only dialogue that we did see through tweets were basically the Sisi and Muslim Brotherhood cursing each other, making fun of Morsi or making fun of Sisi. So that's I think really interesting and worth keeping in mind when sort of thinking of how the blogosphere started with early adopters and how they became sort of the alternative to mainstream media, the alternative narrative. And the switch to social media, and now what we're seeing on social media is this polarization. So we're seeing different narratives, but there is no dialogue happening. I'm going to switch to, do you see the Bahrain Twitter map?
Wow.
Yep. Again.
I love the circle. You guys, this is part of the aesthetic, is putting them into a circle, huh?
Yeah.
Well done. That's not an easy challenge. Are you guys using, is this Gephi or no?
It is, but it is Gephi, but we're using Morningside Analytics. I think they recently just changed their name, so I'll have to double check on the name. But they basically run the algorithms that we give them a seed set of, for example, Twitter handles, or in the blogosphere, a seed set of blogs, and they spider based on certain sets of algorithms. And they collect all of this data and visualize it.
And do they give you the nodes and edges? Do they give you the edges?
Yeah.
They give you the edges. So that's the algorithm that they do.
Well, yeah. I mean, we see this, basically, and we analyze. There's a lot of data that comes along with it, handles, hashtags, stuff like that. So we do, and we tend to also, we've done a number of variations on these maps, and we tend to sort of tell them where to cut off the map. Because if you spider and let it go, let the spidering or the algorithm run, you can collect so much data. It could keep going. And so we stop it at a certain point where we can actually see something or read something in the data.
How big is this set?
Oh, sorry. The seed set was at least 200, if not more, handles.
Okay.
Of prominence and a mix of Twitter handles.
Okay.
Yeah. And but to go back to the map, this is, I think it explains itself in a sense. I'm not going to go through the details of the colors and stuff, but basically you see this like distinct divide between the right side and the left side. And on the right is basically the pro-government / military supporters. And on the left, you see the pro-revolution Shiite supporters and human rights organizations. So they're very two distinct clusters. And you see, of course, there are different clusters with different follower bases. You see in the map, we saw a number of regional clusters where you have, for example, Saudi Arabia that follows the pro-government. clusters, whereas on the other side you see, for example, Lebanese Shiite or Shiite or Kuwaiti Shiite followers. But I think it goes, if putting the Egyptian Twitter sphere in mind and looking at this, you see again the polarization.
Yeah.
So I guess that's one point I want to drive through, is that unfortunately, even though we were hoping to see a network public sphere, it still somewhat exists, but we're seeing a lot of polarization that's going on on social media. We're seeing a diminishing of the blogger sphere, a deactivation of a lot of blogs, or people just stop blogging, and a shift towards social media and a polarization on there. And I think it's really interesting to see how things are going to move forward, because there was this huge hype in 2011, 2012, up to maybe 2 years ago, about how social media played a role in these revolutions, how alternative narratives were able to emerge during that time period because, of Twitter or Facebook, although obviously they weren't the cause of the revolutions. Now we're seeing, I think, a different shift as well. This requires further analysis and study, but we are seeing a shift. The early adopters are no longer tweeting as much. They're no longer on social media as much, because the narrative itself is being diluted. You have more and more people that have started adopting these different platforms, especially Facebook. And so you're seeing a lot of people sort of working within their own enclaves or clusters online, or they just stopped blogging or tweeting or on Facebook as a whole. Of course, that doesn't, a lot of them were also arrested in the process. So there are a lot of activists, political activists and digital activists who have been arrested in the past few years as well. So there's been an attempt to silence these voices. So I think looking forward, it'll be interesting to see if there is a shift to a different platform, or if people are going to stick with Facebook or Twitter. And it'll be interesting to see if we can actually get more information on the discussions and topics and that are being discussed on these platforms, if we have access to the data, but also to see how activists are using these platforms. And I think one very important thing to think about when addressing these platforms is that they have, I'm going to take Facebook as an example, and I always use it as an example because it's very prominent in the Arab world. A lot of people use it, it comes hand in hand. I think Facebook is the top or second most visited site in the Arab world after Google. And so there's a high penetration of Arabs on that platform. And I think what really is worth looking at is how Facebook controls the information flow on the platform. There are algorithms that basically control your news feed. So it's interesting to look at what people see, for example, what I would see here in Ramallah with my group of friends, and what you would see in Santa Barbara. And so it's interesting to see how Facebook controls that flow of information and how that can affect future campaigns happening on that platform. So I think that's one thing to worth looking into now moving forward, since this is a very prominent platform. And the other thing is also a focus on digital rights. I'm personally doing a lot of work in that field, and now with VecBox, which is an initiative that I'm co-founding here, it's both makerspace and a knowledge hub to basically do research, conduct research on digital rights, and sort of basically offer a different view to the community regarding technology. So we're trying to provide a sense of critical thinking for the community here.
Wow, fantastic! Wow, yeah. That's awesome. I'm excited. I mean, I wonder, what do you think is next?
That's a good question.
I mean, we're finding a really localized, retreating, an atmosphere of strategic and tactical lay lowness. Things are happening, they're just invisible.
Mhm.
And media as a platform, um, I mean, definitely doesn't. How does media at this juncture? How is it serving activist voices? I think is the question, or not just active. I mean, just public voices around public sentiment and around social change and um, community interests.
Yeah, I
So
mean, I think.
where are we going? I mean, I know we're in the quiet space, but where are we going?
Yeah, there's a bit of a lull. Like I said, a lot of people are sort of have retreated to their enclaves or their own clusters, or have stopped actually writing or tweeting or using social media. And I mean, I say stopped in the sense that they're no longer appearing online. It doesn't mean that they've stopped offline. And I hate placing a divide between offline and online because there's very little divide, but still, like, we're not seeing that prominence anymore, that active sort of trying to create an alternative narrative to what's going on. And I think part of that is activism fatigue. um, I think, activists go through periods of sort of, there's a hyper energized time period, and then there are so many sort of periods where there's complete fatigue. So that, I think that's part of it. I think we're seeing a period of fatigue. The other part is that, like I said, there's a lot of narratives that have emerged. So we're seeing all the different political narratives that are happening in Egypt, but they're also clashing with each other. They're not speaking to each other, and it's a constant clash. So we're seeing polarization and a dilution to the narrative. So that's also, I think we're not hearing a very clear message either. So that's part of it. What's happening, what's coming up, I honestly don't know. I'm seeing a lot of focus on Facebook because people are there. And so I'm very wary of the use of Facebook because of the algorithms that I mentioned, because we don't know how the information is controlled, how much data you're giving up. And I think this is something that I know a lot of activists are aware of, and that may be part of the issue, where they're not as active on Facebook. Um, but I still see this as the platform that certain groups still tend to use, more so than blogging, more so than Twitter.
Or
Uh,
maybe I feel like it's been Facebook's heyday the last. I mean, we're also seeing, as things spike and go up and down, we're definitely seeing it's a time for Facebook, definitely.
yeah,
There's been a lot of innovation on the platform, and they've maintained their own analytics, and they've done things. I mean, they've in terms of design, they're completely different from Twitter. They're very different from Twitter structurally, um, as a company, content, interface design, all of it.
of course. I mean, with Twitter, you're restricted to 140 characters, whereas on Facebook you can rant, which I've seen a lot more in the past 2 years, more so than in the past. So you have a lot of people who are just typing long like, not conversations, but opinions. So it's almost like a return to blogging, but on Facebook.
And now you can do sentiment analysis. You just can't do it with 140 characters without
Yes.
people laughing at you.
Yeah.
I mean, sentiment analysis is a little bit for a very ironic and platform like Twitter with such few. Just you can't do much. But with Facebook, I think it's interesting. But I don't know where. I mean, I just wonder. And then there's also like Instagram, which is the quiet thing in the back. And then I think
Hmm.
it's multi-layered, and now it's interesting to think about not just these platforms, but also who occupies them institutionally and personally. There's a lot of institutions that use certain
Yes.
platforms that don't use other platforms. The divide between the institution. Facebook does this very, viscerally. Like you either have a page or you're a person. You have to have a person. You have to use your real name. So they're
Yeah.
really trying to define their user groups,
Hmm.
really tight definition on them. So I don't know. I don't know where we are, where it's moving towards, but I will say that I think that we're moving towards more AI, and there's a really interesting article you should take a look at when speaking of algorithms. It's called "Trending is Trending:
Hmm.
When Algorithms Become Culture,"
Yeah.
and just pre-released. Actually, it's coming out in an anthology. It's Tarleton Gillespie wrote it, and I think he makes it available on his website or something. You should take a look. It's
I
fascinating.
will. I will.
Because
I definitely will.
looking into these whole trends and really looking, I think we're gonna, in terms of media studies and digital and studying this material, I think we're gonna look more and more into users and more network analysis. I can see that because of the polarizations that we're finding across the board, and not this is
Hmm.
not Middle East specific. Yesterday,
Exactly.
we had a really delightful Skype call with Gilad Lotan
Yeah.
uh, from Social Flow, and he's fantastic. And he was giving us an analysis of the Second Amendment gun
Yep. I've
issue
seen that.
in states. And oh, you saw his graph? It's
I've
fascinating.
seen it. Yeah.
The conversations are there's a black space between them. There are completely separate clusters of people. And
Yeah.
then there's this slow movement of the people who are pro gun safety moving towards the gun advocates.
See,
Um,
this is where I'd start looking for bridge figures, the
right,
so-called bridge figures. You'd look
right.
at people who can bridge between both worlds, and you'll see if whether they are can convince one side to shift to the other or not, or if there's a complete divide. And that's actually those people, individuals or organizations, are really worth studying.
Very interesting.
Yeah,
Very cool. Yeah, we need, this is wonderful. I think I wish that my students were here live because I know they're going to
I
have
know.
questions too. So is it okay if they email you if they have
Uh,
specific questions? Or
yes,
maybe
and I was going to suggest you can gather all the questions in one email and send it over to me.
okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
All
Yeah,
right.
I'm sorry. I would have loved to be live, like live with the class, but with a 10-hour difference, it's a bit rough.
Yeah, no, we do live in exist in material bodies after all. And we do need to sleep and eat and all of that
Yeah.
stuff. So, but thanks, it's been a delight. I'm gonna you stay with me for a second after I
Yeah.
hang up or
Yeah.
press stop here.
Thank you.